The sun crawled low over Dryfield Ridge, turning the dust to gold and stretching shadows long across the parched earth. Heat shimmered off the broken fence rails, and the cracked soil crunched beneath Eli Rourke's boots as he trudged through the dry pasture, his hand trailing along the rump of a skinny steer. The cattle were restless, lowing in the haze, thirsty and lean from another dry summer. Eli barely noticed anymore. This land, like his bones, had grown brittle and quiet with age. 53 years had carved lines deep into his face, weathered and creased like the prairie itself. He hadn't spoken more than a few words in days, not since the last drifter came looking for work and left at the sight of his shotgun propped by the door. A distant clatter rolled across the heat, wooden wheels bouncing over rock, a rusty iron hinge shrieking against the breeze. Eli straightened. No one came this far west without a reason. He shielded his eyes from the glare and spotted the silhouette of a broken wagon at the edge of his field. One wheel half collapsed, its mule lathered and foaming. The animal strained against its reins, tethered loosely to a splintered rail by the barn. Eli's eyes narrowed. He approached slowly, shotgun in one hand, dust rising around his boots. The wagon was old and filthy, a patchwork of repairs along its frame. Sacks of potatoes were heaped haphazardly in the bed, though something about the shape and weight of them caught Eli's attention. The air felt tight, heavy with something unsaid. Then a sound, barely more than breath, a muffled cough. Eli stepped closer, heart thudding like a distant drumbeat. He pulled one of the sacks away, and there, blinking up at him from the shadows, was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 10. Her skin was dust-covered, hair tangled and thick with dirt. Green eyes, wide and unblinking, met his without fear. Behind her, 2 smaller girls lay curled together like pups, their faces streaked with sweat and grime. The oldest girl looked at him solemnly. "We'll be quiet if you remove the sacks," she said, her voice low, hoarse from thirst but steady. There was something behind it, something too calm for a child. Eli stared at her, his throat tightening. He glanced around instinctively, as if someone might be watching. With a grunt, he dropped the shotgun to his side and lifted the rest of the burlap sacks away. The younger girls didn't move. One held a torn doll against her chest. The other just stared at the sky, lips trembling. He didn't ask questions, not yet. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a canteen, and handed it to the green-eyed girl. She took it and passed it to the others first before sipping. Her hands were shaking, but her gaze never left his face. "Where'd you come from?" he asked finally. The girl glanced at the horizon, then down. "The ridge," she said softly. "They took us. We ran last night. Thought this wagon would get us far. Mule collapsed." Eli felt something cold settle in his gut. The ridge. That meant the Picket Ridge Boys, one of the last outlaw bands still crawling through the back canyons. Slavers, smugglers, killers. He'd heard rumors, stories passed like poison through saloons and trading posts. And now 3 of their runaways were sitting in his yard, hidden under sackcloth. He didn't speak again. Instead, he helped them out of the wagon, each girl light as air, like they hadn't eaten in days. He brought them inside the barn, sat them on an overturned trough, and found some jerky and a chip-tin cup of goat milk. The green-eyed girl watched everything, taking in the barn's layout, the tools, the hayloft. She ate slowly, carefully, not like a starving child, but like someone used to not trusting her food. Eli studied her. She had too much awareness, too much stillness. This wasn't her first escape. "What's your name?" he asked. "Willow," she said. "Them two's Emma and Ruthie." "How long were you with them?" Willow's jaw twitched. "Long enough." There wasn't much else said. He didn't push. He knew the weight of silence better than most. Eli brought them blankets and let them rest, but he couldn't rest himself. He stood just outside the barn, watching the sky turn purple and the shadows grow teeth. He'd buried his daughter 10 years ago, burned alive when outlaws torched a trading post for sport. The lawman said it was an accident. The preacher said it was God's will. Eli had said nothing, just stopped talking and moved further west until the land grew silent enough to match the inside of his head. Now these girls were here, dragged from the same sort of nightmare he'd never managed to wake from. He walked to the well and drew up a fresh bucket. As he did, a hawk circled overhead, its cry sharp and distant. A bad sign, some used to say. Eli wasn't sure he believed in signs anymore, but he knew danger when it circled this close. Inside, Willow tucked the other two girls into the hay, keeping a watchful eye on the slats of light between the boards. Her little hands stayed clenched. She didn't speak, but she didn't sleep either. She just waited. When Eli returned, she looked at him like a grown woman might, a test behind her eyes. He nodded once. "You can stay in the loft tonight," he said. "It's warm and high, and if anyone comes, they won't find you right off." Willow didn't thank him. She only nodded. He climbed the ladder himself, cleared space, laid down the blankets. When he turned to help the others up, she already had Ruthie on her back and Emma by the hand. He let them settle. Below, in the barn's dim light, he pulled a tarp over the wagon and moved it behind the barn wall. He swept away the tracks, scattered fresh straw. A dozen little things that might buy them time. Time. That was all he could give them. As the first low rumble of thunder rolled across the plains, Eli stood on his porch and stared into the darkening distance. His old revolver sat inside, unloaded and wrapped in oilcloth. He hadn't touched it in years. Not since he swore never to take another life. Not since he stopped being a man at all. Just a caretaker of silence and ghosts. But the wind carried voices that night, echoes on the rim of the ridge, and he knew the picket boys wouldn't be far behind. The storm would break soon, and when it did, he'd have to decide if he was still the kind of man who let others die, or the kind who stood in the path of the fire and finally made it stop. Morning came like an old man's breath, slow, dry, and full of dread. The sky was a sheet of dull brass, clouds gathering like secrets above the ridge. Eli stood at the barn door with a cup of weak coffee, the tin warm in his hands, but offering no comfort. His eyes scanned the horizon as if the wind itself could carry danger, and by mid-morning it did. The riders appeared from the south in a line, 5 of them, long coats flapping behind dust-lathered horses. Each man was armed, rifles slung across their backs, pistols resting heavy at their sides. They didn't bother to approach quiet. The lead rider peeled ahead, and the others fanned out slowly, like buzzards circling fresh kill. Eli's heart thumped, slow and cold. His boots carried him forward as if by habit alone, his coffee forgotten. He knew the man on the black horse before the rider even spoke. Hatch Loring, scarred down one cheek, eyes like shattered slate. 10 years hadn't softened him, only sharpened the hate worn into his bones. "Didn't think you were still breathing out here, Rourke," Hatch called, swinging down from the saddle. He looked around the ranch with a smirk, then spit into the dust. "We was told there was a busted wagon on this trail. You see anything last night?" Eli stood still. "Just wind." "You sure?" Hatch's eyes narrowed. "Wind don't bleed. Wind don't cry." Eli swallowed, his hand tight around the tin. Nothing came through. Hatch stepped closer. The others stayed near their horses, but their hands never strayed far from their weapons. Hatch let his gaze drift toward the barn. "Funny thing, Eli. You always did have a knack for taking in lost causes. Strays. Ghosts. I don't have room for ghosts anymore," Eli said. "They fill up the house." Hatch smiled, slow and poisonous. "That's so." He pulled a silver coin from his coat pocket, flipped it through his fingers. "We're looking for 3 little runaways. Ain't ours by blood, but we took the time to raise 'em up proper. They ran off yesterday. Heard they were seen heading this way." Eli didn't look at the barn. "Can't help you." "You could try." "I'm done trying." The coin landed in the dust between them, sunlight flashing off its edge. Hatch leaned in, close enough that Eli could smell the tobacco and rot clinging to his breath. "You ever wonder why they burned your house, Eli? Why the fire found your wife and girl instead of the man it was meant for?" His voice dropped low, the drawl thickening. "Truth is, you made enemies easy. You never knew when to shut up and let evil pass." Eli didn't flinch. "You just told me you did." "I told you nothing," Hatch said, stepping back. "But if I find out you're hiding what's mine," he glanced toward the loft again, "you'll get to bury a few more." Without waiting for a reply, he mounted up. The others followed, and soon the 5 riders were disappearing into the shimmering horizon, their shadows stretching like fingers behind them. Inside the barn, the silence cracked like ice. Willow lay flat in the loft, a finger pressed to Ruthie's lips. Emma was tucked under a feed sack, her breath shallow. The thudding of boots had passed, but the tremor of them remained in the wooden beams. Willow's eyes, wide and dark, stayed on the slats of light cutting through the boards. Only when the final hoofbeats had faded did she exhale. Below, Eli leaned against the wall and closed his eyes. The girl's composure, too practiced, too calm, sent something jagged slicing through his memory. He didn't ask if they'd heard. Of course they had. The loft boards were thin. Truth had a way of leaking through even thicker walls. At sundown, he sat on the porch while the wind carried the dry scent of smoke from the hills. The girls ate quietly in the barn, too tired to be afraid, too used to it to ask why. Willow lingered in the doorway, watching him. She didn't speak, but her presence pressed against him like a question he didn't want to answer. When night fell, he lit a lantern and returned inside. The floor groaned under his boots as he knelt by the corner of the hearth and pried up the loose floorboard. Beneath it, wrapped in worn canvas, lay a Colt revolver, blackened with oil and time. He sat cross-legged and stared at it. His hands, once calloused and sure, trembled slightly as he unwrapped it. 6 chambers, all empty. He remembered every round that had once sat inside, and every reason he'd stopped using them. He loaded it slowly. The metal clicked like memories coming home. Coyotes howled out in the far canyons. Inside the barn, the girl's breathing filled the silence, steady, unbroken. It had been a long time since he'd been responsible for anyone's heartbeat but his own. A longer time since someone trusted him to protect it. He leaned a revolver against the wall and slumped into the chair by the window. Smoke was rising again, not from his land, not yet, but close enough. Danger didn't knock in these parts. It circled first. It tasted the air. And then it came for blood. Sleep refused him. Instead, he watched the stars flicker between clouds and listened for anything unnatural in the night. But only the wind came, and the memory it carried with it. He hadn't seen her face until they dragged him to the burnt frame of the post station. His daughter, May, 6 years old, hair like his wife's, eyes too big for her tiny skull. The fire had taken everything soft from her. They said she was caught in the storeroom. They said it was a mistake, wrong building, wrong time, just bad luck. But Eli had heard otherwise. From a dying drunk in a jail cell 3 towns over. From a scarred ranch hand who'd once ridden with the Picket Ridge boys. Hatch Loring hadn't just lit that fire. He'd smiled when he did it. He'd looked back once. The law said there was no proof. The preacher said vengeance belonged to the Lord. Eli had said nothing. Now Hatch was back. And this time, the fire was aimed at someone else's daughters. The revolver lay heavy on his lap. He didn't know if he could do what had to be done. Not yet. But something in Willow's green eyes, calm and alert even as death rode up his trail, told him this was the end of running. One way or another. Outside, the land held its breath. Smoke curled across the ridge like a promise. And in the dark corners of the barn, justice stirred in silence, waiting. Dawn crept over the hills in slow strokes of pink and smoke gray, painting the broken fences and thorn brush in gentle light. Eli stood by the barn door, map in one hand, revolver in the other, the muscles in his jaw locked tight as rusted hinges. The girls huddled near the water barrel, their thin shoulders swaddled in hand-stitched shawls. He crouched and laid the map on a plank. This trail here cuts east through the gullies. There's a schoolhouse in Lenlow, 2 towns out. Follow the creek till it splits, then head north. You'll be safe there. Emma and Ruthie clung to each other, unsure whether to cry or run. But Willow stepped forward, fists clenched, chin stubborn. I'm not leaving. Eli shook his head. You will. No, she said, fire beneath her voice. I can help. You're just I ain't helpless. Her eyes burned straight into him. You said your daughter died in a fire. If someone had helped her, would she still be dead? The words landed like a hammer to the chest. Eli looked at her, really looked, the grit, the rage, the fierce quiet that masked her fear. He didn't see a child. He saw something rawer than age, He closed his eyes, cursed under his breath, and opened the storm door to the root cellar. Stay down there. If I whistle twice, you run. If I don't come back, I'll know what to do, she said. The wind changed around mid-morning. Hotter. Unnatural. Eli sat on the porch, rifle across his lap, pulse ticking loud behind his ears. Around noon, the silence broke. 5 riders again, maybe more, but this time they didn't come slow. Dust churned behind them like fire smoke, and their formation was tighter, teeth bared. Hatch led them, his coat open, revolver already drawn, face set like carved stone. They didn't ask questions this time. They circled the house, 2 to the barn, 2 toward the well. Hatch came straight to the porch. You didn't take my warning, Eli, he said, voice slick with venom. Now I'm done asking. Eli stood slowly. You want to search the place? Go ahead. You'll find nothing. Oh, I'll find something, Hatch said, nodding to the others. Fan out. They moved fast, too confident. The 2 by the barn didn't notice the gate latch undone, didn't notice the trail of salt leading to the straw. Willow, crouched in the stall shadows, struck a match and let it drop into the dry feed soaked in oil. She didn't flinch as flame rushed outward in a burst of red and gold. The horses screamed and bolted, stampeding past the startled outlaws. Shouts erupted. Gunfire cracked. Inside the house, Eli waited until the door swung open, then fired. The first outlaw took the shot square in the chest, spinning back into the hallway. The second returned fire, splintering the wood above Eli's head. He rolled behind the stove, fired again, and caught the man in the leg. A scream rang out, followed by the heavy thump of collapse. Smoke poured through the cracks in the doorframe. The barn was ablaze now, and the outlaws were shouting for buckets, for cover, for control. But panic had its own language, and they couldn't speak it fast enough. Hatch kicked through the front door, just as Eli ducked around the table. They locked eyes, 10 years of hate swelling between them like blood rising. Hatch fired first, grazing Eli's shoulder, spinning him sideways. Eli cried out and stumbled against the wall, the pain searing through muscle and memory alike. Another shot, this one wide. Willow appeared in the doorway, face streaked with soot, a glass lantern clutched in both hands. She didn't yell. She didn't run. She just threw it hard, into the space between Hatch and Eli. The lantern exploded on contact, glass and flame erupting across the room. Hatch cursed and staggered back, coat catching fire. Eli didn't waste a moment. He surged forward, shoulder screaming, and tackled Hatch through the doorway and into the yard. They hit the dirt in a whirl of fists and ash. Hatch reached for his sidearm, but Eli kicked it away. The 2 rolled beneath the flaming sky, one clawing at survival, the other at retribution. Hatch landed a punch to Eli's jaw. Eli responded with the butt of his pistol, cracking it across Hatch's temple. Both men rose slowly. Smoke billowed behind them, flames licking up the rafters of the barn, the heat unbearable. Somewhere, a horse shrieked and galloped into the distance. Hatch staggered into the barn's open mouth, dazed and bleeding. Eli followed, revolver in hand. Inside, the air was thick and glowing orange. Shadows danced like demons across the walls. Hay smoldered underfoot. You should have stayed dead, Rourke, Hatch rasped, drawing his knife. I did, Eli said, but you brought something back. They circled each other between the beams, old ghosts flickering through the rising smoke. You always were soft, Hatch spat, wiping blood from his lip. Couldn't even save your own. Eli fired once. The shot echoed like thunder. Hatch dropped to his knees, surprise still in his eyes. The knife fell first, then the man. Eli limped forward, revolver still raised. You took my family once, he said, voice low and hard. You don't get this one. Hatch collapsed onto the burning straw, and the flames took him in silence. Outside, Willow waited by the pump, face streaked with ash, eyes locked on the barn. When Eli emerged, bloodied and limping, she ran to his side. It's done, he told her, breath ragged. She looked past him at the burning wreckage. Not yet, she said. We need to bury the past before the fire takes the truth with it. He nodded once and leaned against her shoulder. The barn crackled behind them like the closing of an old book. The fire line had been drawn and crossed. The fire had eaten through the barn. The roof long collapsed, embers drifting upward like dying stars. The house still stood, scorched and cracked but stubborn in its survival, much like the man who had defended it. Eli lay in the dirt just beyond the smoldering fence, his shoulder wrapped in a strip of cloth torn from his own shirt. The bleeding had slowed, though his strength had gone with it. The sun rose slow behind him, casting golden light across the battlefield of his life. Smoke curled into the sky, soft and gray now, as though the land itself were exhaling. Willow knelt beside him, her hands steady despite the soot on her face. She'd wiped the blood from his brow with the hem of her dress, tied the bandage as tight as she dared. Her small frame shielded him from the breeze, and though her voice didn't speak, her presence whispered something older than words. I'm here, and you're not alone. Eli looked up at the sky and wondered if it was the same one his daughter had seen before the fire took her. Then he looked at Willow, and the ache inside him changed shape. It was no longer hollow. It was a firelight flicker, warm and painful, but alive. Around them, the air began to settle. The wind carried no more threats, only ash and morning birdsong. By midday, distant hoofbeats broke the silence again, but these weren't like the last. These came with measured rhythm, dust trailing behind a pair of riders. One wore a brown coat, faded by years on the trail. The other was a woman in spectacles and a sun hat, dismounting before the horses had fully stopped. She rushed toward the house, calling names, Emma, Ruthie, her voice a mixture of panic and hope. When the barn smoke parted and the girls stepped out from the root cellar, blinking and pale, the woman fell to her knees and wept. The schoolteacher from Lenlow had come searching, and with her came 2 deputies. When they found Eli propped against the fence, pale but breathing, they asked if he was the one who'd stopped the Picket Ridge gang. "I'm the one who didn't run," he muttered, then nodded toward the barn. The rest of the story's in there. Over the next day, as the fire cooled and the bodies were counted, the truth spread faster than smoke ever could. Hatch Loring was dead. His men either shot or fled into the hills. The schoolteacher confirmed the girls' identities, 3 names on a list of missing children who'd vanished along frontier roads. No one called Eli a hero to his face, and that suited him just fine. But something in the way people looked at him shifted, like they'd remembered he was still a man, not just the ghost of one. The lawmen offered to bring Willow to town, find her a home. Eli only looked at her once. "She's got one," he said. Weeks passed. The soil stayed dry, but the air began to soften. Birds returned to the fence posts, and the wind no longer tasted of fire. Eli rebuilt what he could with slow hands and stubborn will. The house was patched, the corral mended. The barn would take longer, but he didn't mind. The work filled the quiet. Willow stayed. She took to the chores like someone who knew they mattered. She mucked stalls, boiled water for coffee, and learned the names of every remaining cow. They barely spoke the first week, both careful in the space between grief and healing. But one morning she called him by name. Just Eli at first. A week later, she called him Pa. The other girls wrote from the schoolhouse, short letters with crooked lines and joyful drawings. Eli kept them in a tin box on the mantel. Some nights, he'd take them out, read them in silence, and wonder what a man like him had done to deserve anything whole again. One morning, he sat on the porch, polishing the revolver he'd buried twice in his life. Willow brought him coffee and sat beside him, her legs swinging just above the floorboards. The sky was wide and clean, and for the first time in years, Eli smiled without it hurting. Some say Eli Rourke died the day his family burned. Others say he died long before, somewhere in the mud of war or the silence after the law gave up on justice. But there are those, old cowhands and town drunks, quiet bartenders and wide-eyed schoolboys, who say he came back the moment a girl whispered through the sacks in the back of a broken wagon. They say the fire that took everything from him once came again, but this time it didn't leave him empty. It left him changed. And somewhere out in the vast quiet beyond Dryfield Ridge, Justice still walks on 2 boots and a bad shoulder, with a girl beside him who never learned to run.